Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sanjay and in this video we're going to look at a comparison between VAS and A200. That's Vanguard's Australian shares product and BetaShares Australia 200 product. Now I actually had this request from one of my viewers, Garazi Romero Vallejo. I hope I pronounced your name right, Garazi. I apologize if I didn't, but he basically asked, what about A200 versus VAS off one of my previous videos? And I thought, absolutely. This is actually going to be a common question where generally someone's interested in investing in the Australian share market. They want to do it through ETFs. And when they Google, these are two of the most common ETFs that will come up. It will usually be something along A200 is great because it's got low fees. VAS is great because it's Vanguard. Everyone loves Vanguard. It's the original ETF provider. And it's also a broad ETF, so how can you go wrong? In this video, I want to go through the fees, the index, and the returns, and the companies involved. Those are generally the key things that you should really be looking out for, plus probably what are the overlaps in the ETF. So let's get into it. So when we look at VAS against A200, we see market cap, one is a lot bigger than the other, probably because it's been around for a long time and it's quite popular. The fees are actually quite similar. Now, when BetaShares came out, it was at this 0.07% fee size. And Vanguard, I think, came out a bit higher, but it's progressively being brought down in terms of its fees. But what does 0.1% against 0.07% really mean? Well, it means if you're investing $1,000 in either of these ETFs, you're going to be paying the difference between $1.70. Let me give you a little tip, by the way. If you want to sound really smart when it comes to personal finance and investing, using the term basis points makes you sound incredibly switched on. So 1 basis point is 0.01%, 10 basis points is 0.1%, and 100 basis points is 1%. So in this situation, you can say you're looking at the difference between 10 basis points and 7 basis points. It's 3 basis points in between. Is that worth worrying about? There you go, hot tip. Now, when you look at the index, and the index is actually the most critical part of looking at these two companies, because indexes or indices are what drive the ETF. The index is literally the list of companies this ETF is going to invest in versus what the other ETF is going to invest in. The brand names don't really matter, whether it's a BetaShares or a Vanguard. What really matters is what is the index that each of these ETFs are tracking. When you're looking at BetaShares, you're looking at the selective 200 index, whereas with Vanguard, it's the S&P 300 index. Broadly speaking, it's 200 companies versus the top 300 companies. Total returns, this is coming from their websites, and I've used the November 2020 numbers over the last 12 months. Might have been updated since I put this video together, but you can check these out on their websites. It's pretty straightforward. Total returns is important because you're looking at both the capital gains plus the dividends that these ETFs have paid out. And what you're seeing is negative 2.2% against negative 1.5%. Is that worth worrying about too much? Someone might say over a long period of time that might compound into a big thing. My initial thoughts are the total returns are pretty close. They're pretty much tracking their own indexes. Why would you worry so much about having to differentiate between those two? Now the top 10 holdings, very similar. Without looking at any index methodology, generally I can tell you in any ASX focused Australian ETF, there's always going to be the usual suspects such as the big four banks, a mining company, CSL will probably be in there, and probably a conglomerate like Wesfarmers will throw itself in there as well. And that's what you're seeing here, miners, banks, and the conglomerates. And these top 10 holdings will probably account for quite a large portion of the actual index, because that's often what happens is the big companies actually account for a large portion. Now, both these indices are market cap weighted. That means the larger companies account for a larger portion of the ETF. The alternative is equal weighting, where it doesn't matter if it's a big company or a small company. All top 200 companies have an equal weighting in the ETF. Neither of these ETFs have indices that do that. Now, to go into a little bit more detail about the fees and to give you a bit more visualization, I've thrown up this quick graph which just looks at what does the fee comparison look like if you had invested $5,000 a year for 20 years to get like a $100,000 ETF size. What would it look like over that time? And I've sort of done some approximate calculations here, looking at the difference between spending $800 in fees over 20 years and $1,000 in fees over 20 years. Now, this assumes there was no capital growth in the ETF, but again, like, I wouldn't worry too much when it comes to 3 basis points in fees. Are you going to get too caught up in $300 in fees? Hopefully not. $400, sorry, $400 in fees. Personally, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but again, it's up to you how much you want to put weighting into this kind of difference in fees coming from 3 basis points. Now, when it comes to returns, I've used Yahoo Finance as a quick relative measure. I've thrown in VAS and A200 against a 2-year trend, and you basically can't even tell the difference between the two. You can see right at the end, there was a slight difference between, I think, 19% and maybe 18% returns over that period, but you can see they're pretty much sitting on top of each other. What does that mean? That means the top 200 and the top 300 companies are pretty much doing the same thing in terms of returns. I zoomed in on 1 year, and you can see even during the pandemic, they pretty much fell together and they've risen together. Again, pretty much sitting on top of each other. Now, what you're seeing here is only capital gains or capital movements, really. It doesn't take into account the dividends, which is what the little D's that you often see at the bottom of Yahoo Finance represents. But that's why I also included the total returns in that table, and that's something you can get from the actual ETF websites, where they'll tell you what were the distribution returns plus the capital gains to give you this much in terms of gross returns. So how would I round this out? If I had to compare and sort of make a decision on this, the mindset I would be looking at is the following. I would say to myself, over the next X amount of years, however many years you want to invest in, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, do you think the top 200 companies or the top 300 companies are going to perform better? Or put it another way, do you want to go in with a narrow focus, top 200, or do you want to go in with a broad focus when it comes to the Australian share market, top 300 companies? That's really what it comes down to. For me, I always like the idea of getting a broad ETF because I feel like I invest in ETFs for the idea of having broad, diverse exposure to the entire share market. Assuming they have very similar fees, which we're looking at a 3 basis point difference, I'd say that's pretty similar. What would I pick? I'd pick the broader ETF. Because put it another way, when you buy VAS, you're buying A200 plus 100 companies. Now, to be honest, I haven't done a full analysis where I've downloaded the holdings for A200 and downloaded the holdings for VAS and done a direct comparison between the two. But broadly, I'd say if there's 200 companies and the other one's got 300 companies, you're going to get quite a bit of overlap. And that's my takeaway. I'd lean towards the broader ETF. Anyway, hopefully you found that useful. Remember, there are a couple of other products out there that do let you invest in the Australian share market. They come from State Street, BlackRock, and VanEck, and I'll list up the names of those ETFs here as well. If you have any questions, leave them below in the comments or any requests for future videos. Check out some of my other videos on ETFs and investing, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.